Carlos Alcaraz sat on the edge of the bench in the dimly lit players' lounge, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to process everything that had just unraveled. The hum of the flickering fluorescent lights above did little to soothe the tempest building inside him. Normally, this room buzzed with the sounds of light-hearted conversations, laughter, and the casual banter of players coming off the court. But tonight, the space felt eerily quiet, like the calm after a storm, broken only by distant murmurs outside the press room. The press conference had just concluded, yet Carlos could still feel the weight of his own words echoing in his head, each syllable stinging like a fresh wound. For years, he had carried this burden, an unbearable truth locked deep within the recesses of his mind. But tonight, under the calculated stare of Jannik Sinner during the match, something had snapped. The dam holding back his frustration, his anger, and most terrifyingly, the secret he had sworn never to reveal, had finally burst. The match itself had been nothing short of a battlefield, a 5-set epic played under glaring spotlights. Every shot felt like more than just a strike to the lines, it was aimed at Carlos's very soul. Sinner's immaculate precision and unshakable calm only amplified Alcaraz's mounting frustration. They had faced each other before, but this time, something was different. The stakes felt higher. It was personal, raw, and suffocating. As the 5th set reached its peak, Carlos faltered. His focus wavered, his composure cracked, and when Sinner's final forehand kissed the line, the match was over. Carlos had stormed off the court without so much as a handshake. His thoughts raced, his heart thundered in his chest as if trying to outpace his emotions. Minutes later in the press conference, the questions came at him relentlessly, sharp and precise, much like volleys at the net. Most reporters focused on the match's technical details, errors, tactics, and missed opportunities. But then, one question hit a nerve. Do you think Sinner holds a psychological edge over you, given how often he's beaten you in critical moments? Carlos leaned toward the microphone, his face rigid and his eyes flickering with a storm of emotions. Anger, regret, and something else, darker and more fragile. Fear, perhaps. Before he could stop himself, the words escaped. His voice quivered but cut through the room like a blade. "Everyone sees what's on the surface," he started, his tone uneven. "But you don't know the truth. You don't know what I've been carrying for years, what he knows about me that no one else does." The room fell deathly silent. Anticipation hung heavy in the air. Carlos hesitated, his gaze darting toward the PR representative in the corner. The man's eyes widened in silent warning, but it was already too late. The words had been spoken. Carlos exhaled shakily, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Sinner and I, we aren't just rivals. He's been holding something against me. Something from my past I've tried to bury." The cryptic admission rippled through the room like an earthquake. The reporters exploded into chaos, their voices overlapping with frantic questions. Carlos didn't respond. Instead, he pushed back his chair with a sharp screech and stormed out, leaving a bewildered room, and the world, scrambling for answers. Back in the lounge, Carlos slumped forward, burying his face in his hands as the adrenaline from his outburst began to subside. The memories that had led him to this breaking point came rushing back like a flood. It wasn't just tonight's loss, or Sinner's maddening composure. It was what Sinner represented. Years ago, long before either of them became household names in tennis, they were just teenagers competing in a junior tournament in a small Italian town. Carlos had stumbled upon something that night that haunted him to this day. It was late, and the grounds were quiet. Wandering alone, he saw Sinner in a shadowy corner of the facility, talking in hushed tones with a man who oozed an unsettling authority, a presence that hinted at danger. Carlos had watched from a distance as the man handed Sinner a small, nondescript envelope. Though Carlos couldn't hear their exchange, the tension in their body language spoke volumes. Driven by a mix of curiosity and unease, Carlos had followed Sinner discreetly. What he saw next froze him to the core. Sinner had opened the envelope to reveal sheets of information. Data so detailed it was chilling. Weaknesses, patterns, vulnerabilities. And not just general opponent information, but Carlos's own tendencies. Every flaw, every habit laid bare, as if someone had been studying him obsessively for months. Carlos had never confronted Sinner. He didn't know how. He didn't understand what he had witnessed, nor did he know what it meant. Over the years, as their careers took off, the memory faded into the background, overshadowed by the demands and pressures of professional tennis. But every time they faced each other on the court, the weight of that night pressed down on Carlos like a phantom. A nagging voice in his head whispered that Sinner's brilliance wasn't entirely pure. Tonight, watching Sinner anticipate his every move and respond with inhuman precision, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that the ghost of that envelope still lingered. The door creaked open. Carlos looked up to see his coach, Juan Carlos Ferrero, step in cautiously. His expression was a mix of concern and frustration. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Ferrero's voice was low yet firm, a careful calm masking his urgency. Do you realize what you've just done? Carlos felt the words hit him like a sharp jab, but he didn't reply. His fingers trembled slightly as he gestured vaguely, as if that could somehow explain everything. He couldn't find the words. How could he? The emotions were too tangled, the truth too fragile. Ferrero sighed, then lowered himself onto the bench beside him. You've just handed every journalist on the planet a reason to dig into your past, and Sinner's. Whatever you're hiding, it's going to come out now. Carlos's jaw tightened, his gaze locked on the floor. He hesitated for a moment, his voice barely audible when he finally spoke. Maybe it's time. Maybe people need to know what kind of player he really is. Ferrero frowned, his brow furrowing deeply. And what kind of player is that? A tireless worker? A brilliant tactician? Carlos, this could backfire. You could look paranoid. Or worse, bitter. Carlos turned his face away, frustration written across his tense expression. You don't understand, he said, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. He's been holding something against me. Something he never should have had. Ferrero leaned closer, his tone softening, though it remained firm. Then tell me. Tell me what this is about so we can handle it together. For a long moment, Carlos was silent. The words felt heavy, lodged like stones in his throat, but finally, as though releasing a flood, he began to speak. He told Ferrero everything: the quiet Italian night, the envelope, the unsettling knowledge Sinner seemed to wield like a weapon ever since. Ferrero listened intently, his face unreadable as Carlos unraveled the secret. When Carlos finished, the silence between them was loaded with unspoken implications. Finally, Ferrero broke it. If this is true, he said carefully, then we need proof. Without that, this will only make you look delusional. I know what I saw, Carlos replied firmly, his voice steady but strained. And I know it's been affecting our matches. 4 years. Ferrero ran a hand through his hair, the tension in his face clear. All right, he said at last. We'll figure this out. But for now, we need to focus on damage control. The press is going to have a field day with this. Carlos nodded reluctantly, though the knot in his stomach only tightened. Taking the first step would be the hardest part, but he knew the road ahead would be steep and uncertain. As echoes of the night lingered in his mind, one thing was undeniable. The rivalry between him and Sinner had just crossed into dangerous, uncharted territory. Ferrero's earlier words hung in the air like a warning, adding to the weight Carlos already carried. He slumped further into the bench, running a hand through his damp hair. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing inward, amplifying every thought screaming in his mind. He wanted to say more, to make Ferrero understand, but how could he? The truth was far more complex, tangled in years of rivalry, old wounds and lingering doubts. Ferrero sat beside him in uncharacteristic silence, his eyes fixed on the floor. For a man of action, someone always ready with a strategy or a solution, the stillness felt unnatural. Carlos finally broke the silence, his voice low but resolute. You don't realize how long this has been going on, he muttered. Every match we play, he's in my head. It's not just tactics. It's something deeper. Ferrero lifted a skeptical brow, though his tone was measured. Carlos, you're one of the strongest players I've ever coached, mentally and physically. If he's in your head, it's because you let him in. Carlos shook his head vehemently, frustration boiling over. It's not that simple. You didn't see the way he played tonight. He wasn't just reacting. He was predicting, like he knew what I was going to do before I even did. Ferrero's expression softened slightly, though his words remained cautious. I won't deny Sinner's a phenomenal player. But you can't let your imagination turn him into something he isn't. If there's more to this, we need facts, not memories or feelings. Carlos exhaled sharply, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. His thoughts drifted back to that fateful night in Italy. It wasn't just the envelope, it was the small, subtle details that had seemed meaningless at the time. He remembered the next day, how Sinner had been distant, avoiding him with a nervous tension that Carlos hadn't noticed until now. His confidence had seemed forced, his handshake limp and fleeting, nothing like the steady grip Carlos was used to. Back then, Carlos had dismissed it as nerves before a match. But now? He wasn't so sure. And the match itself, God, that match. Sinner had played with an almost eerie precision, countering every strategy with a move that felt premeditated. Every attempt Carlos made to shift momentum had been crushed by Sinner's calculated responses. It wasn't just skill. It couldn't have been. The sound of Ferrero's voice brought him back to the present. Let me ask you something, Ferrero said carefully. If he really had something on you, why hasn't he used it publicly? Why keep it quiet all these years? Because it's not about exposure, Carlos answered with newfound clarity. His voice, though quiet, carried a sharp edge. It's about control. If he reveals it, he loses his leverage. But as long as it stays hidden, he can use it against me whenever he wants. Ferrero frowned, his fingers tapping softly on the armrest as his expression darkened. That's a dangerous game for Sinner to play, he said finally. Are you telling me he's been orchestrating this for years? Using, what? Some kind of file on you? Psychological data, match tendencies. It's more than that, Carlos said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. You didn't see what was in that envelope, Juan Carlos. It wasn't just stats. It was personal, things no one should know about me. The admission hung heavy in the air, filled with implications Ferrero couldn't ignore. His eyes narrowed, his skepticism cracking into something deeper, concern. Personal how? He asked, his tone quieter now. Carlos hesitated, his body tense, his heart racing. He hadn't meant to go this far. But now that he'd started, he couldn't stop. Ferrero needed to understand, even if it meant sharing things he'd kept buried for years. In those days, Carlos began, his voice little more than a whisper, I was struggling, not just with tennis but everything. My family. My confidence. My place in the sport. I kept a journal, a private one. Ferrero's gaze sharpened, realization dawning, but he said nothing. Carlos continued, the words spilling out, carrying years of pain and uncertainty with them. I wrote down all my fears, my doubts and my frustrations. Things I couldn't say out loud, Carlos admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Ferrero's eyes widened slightly, his expression shifting to one of quiet disbelief. And you think Sinner got his hands on that journal? I don't know how, Carlos said, his voice breaking, but I'm sure of it. Some of the things he said during our match, they weren't just mind games. They were too specific, too personal. He knew things no one else could possibly know. Ferrero leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin as his eyes darkened in thought. The room fell silent again, the weight of Carlos's confession settling over them like a dense fog. After a long pause, Ferrero finally spoke, his tone calm but laced with a clear warning. If this is true, then we have to get to the bottom of it. But you need to be absolutely certain, Carlos, absolutely certain. If you go public with this, and it turns out to be a misunderstanding. It's not a misunderstanding, Carlos interrupted sharply, his voice steady and resolute. I know what I saw. I know what I've felt every time we've played since then. He's been using this against me, and I'm done letting him get away with it. Ferrero regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he nodded. All right, he said cautiously. We'll deal with this. But you have to be ready for what comes next. If you push this, it's not just Sinner you're taking on. The media, the fans, the ATP, everyone is going to have an opinion. And not all of them will be on your side. Carlos met Ferrero's gaze head-on, his own eyes burning with an intensity that hadn't been there before. I don't care, he said fiercely. I've kept this to myself for too long, and it's been eating me alive. If Sinner wants to play dirty, then fine. But I'm not staying silent anymore. Ferrero exhaled slowly, a hint of resignation on his face. All right. But if we're going to do this, we have to do it right. No more cryptic comments to the press. No more emotional outbursts. We need a plan. Carlos nodded, the fire in his chest burning brighter. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity, a path forward. The storm within him hadn't calmed, not even close, but now he knew which way the wind was blowing. He leaned back into the sofa, his hands gripping the edges of the cushion like he was bracing against some unseen current. The memories came flooding back, sharp and vivid, forcing him to relive every detail of that night in Italy. He had never told anyone, not his family, not his closest friends on the tour. Ferrero was the first person he trusted enough to share even fragments of the story. And now that the words had started spilling out, it felt like breaking a curse, years of silence finally crumbling under their weight. You don't understand, Carlos muttered, frustration thick in his voice. It wasn't just the envelope. It was everything that happened after. It was like I was being watched, not just by him, but by someone else. Something bigger. Ferrero's brow furrowed slightly, his gaze sharpening. What do you mean by something bigger? Are you saying this goes beyond Sinner? Carlos hesitated, the words feeling dangerous even in the privacy of this room. But he couldn't hold them back any longer. I think he's connected to someone powerful, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The man I saw that night. He wasn't just a coach or a random scout. He had this presence. Like he was used to being in charge, like he owned the room. Ferrero shifted in his seat, crossing his arms over his chest as his skepticism returned. A man with an aura? That's pretty vague, Carlos. Are you sure you weren't imagining things? Stress does strange things to the mind, especially when you're young and under pressure. Carlos shook his head fiercely. No. I wasn't imagining it. I remember him clearly. He didn't belong there. He was too polished, too controlled, like he was part of something, organized. And when I saw Sinner with him, it was like they were in on something. Ferrero dragged a hand down his face, clearly struggling to process everything Carlos was telling him. So what are you saying? That Sinner might be involved in some kind of system? A group? What exactly are you suggesting? Carlos exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair as he searched for the right words. I don't know exactly. But look at how his career has skyrocketed. The sponsorships, the wins, the connections he's made, it's like everything has fallen perfectly into place for him. I'm not saying he doesn't work hard. He does. But there's something else. Something calculated about the way he operates. Ferrero leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he studied Carlos carefully. If what you're saying is true, then this isn't just about you and Sinner anymore. This is about the sport itself. Exposing it could cause a storm the likes of which we've never seen. Carlos swallowed hard, his throat tight as he processed Ferrero's words. He knew his coach was right. If he pushed forward with this, it wouldn't just be his reputation at stake. The integrity of the sport, the trust of the fans, everything could come crashing down. But far from deterring him, the thought only strengthened his resolve. I'm not doing this to destroy anyone, Carlos said finally, his voice steadier than it had been all night. I'm doing this to free myself. Every time I step onto the court against him, I feel like I'm fighting a ghost. Something that's always there, haunting me, holding me back. I need to face it. I need to confront him. Ferrero studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. If you're serious about this, you need to be smart, he said finally. Talking about Sinner in a press conference solves nothing. It just makes you look unstable. If there's something bigger at play here, we need evidence, real, concrete proof. Without that, this will destroy your career. Carlos turned his head away, his jaw tightening. You think I don't know that? He shot back, his voice edged with frustration. You think I haven't spent years convincing myself I imagined it all, that it was just in my head? But it's not. I know what I saw. I know what I felt every time I've played him since. The room fell silent again, the tension between them thick and suffocating. Ferrero's fingers tapped rhythmically against the armrest, his mind clearly racing. Finally he spoke, his voice measured and calm. All right. Let's start from the beginning. Tell me everything, every detail, no matter how small. If we're going to figure this out, I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Carlos hesitated, the weight of his memories pressing down on him. But Ferrero was right. If he was going to face this, he couldn't do it alone. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak, slowly, carefully recounting everything. The tournament. The night he saw Sinner with the man. The envelope. The matches that followed. The lingering unease that never left him. Ferrero listened intently, his expression shifting between concern, disbelief, and something closer to quiet determination. As Carlos spoke, he could see the pieces starting to connect in Ferrero's mind. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't coincidence. There was a pattern, a thread tying everything together. For the first time, Carlos felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone in this anymore. Together, they would uncover the truth, no matter where it led. His voice wavered slightly as he recounted the memories, but he pushed on, determined to let it all out. The floodgates had opened, and now there was no turning back. Keep going, Ferrero said softly, though his voice carried an edge of urgency. He sat frozen, his face a mask of unwavering concentration as he absorbed every word Carlos spoke. The room around them seemed to shrink, its air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. I didn't just see them together that one time, Carlos admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor as if the memories were hiding there, waiting to surface. There were other moments, small, fleeting ones. They didn't make sense back then, but now they feel connected. Ferrero leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. What moments? Be specific, Carlos. If there's a pattern, we need to recognize it. Carlos rubbed his temples, frustration etched into his expression as he tried to articulate the suspicions that had lurked in his mind for years. After that night, I started noticing things, subtle, almost invisible at first. Sinner always seemed to know things before anyone else. Information about the draw, court conditions, sometimes even my own training schedule. At first, I thought he was just well prepared, but there were times, it felt unnatural. Like he wasn't guessing, he knew. Ferrero's brow furrowed, the skepticism on his face softening into concern. You're suggesting he's been spying on you? Not directly, Carlos said quickly, though the thought had crossed his mind more than once.
It's not that.
It's more like, someone has been feeding him information.
And not just about me, about everyone.
That's why he's always so calm, so in control. He's playing with knowledge no one else has. Ferrero's eyes narrowed, his mind clearly racing as he processed Carlos's words. If that's true, he said slowly, then we're dealing with something much bigger than Sinner. Are you saying this goes beyond him? Carlos hesitated, his shoulders tensing under the weight of his own suspicions. I don't know, he admitted, his voice strained. But it feels bigger. That man I saw that night. He wasn't a coach, not a scout. He was something else. And the way Sinner acted around him, it wasn't normal.
He looked afraid.
Or maybe like he owed him something. Ferrero leaned back, his face darkening as he considered the implications. Are you saying Sinner could be under some kind of influence? If that's true, then he's not just your rival. He might be a victim in all of this. Carlos felt his stomach twist at the thought. Despite his anger, his frustration, he couldn't ignore the possibility. Sinner's meteoric rise had always seemed almost too perfect, his path to the top too clean, too smooth. Could it be that he wasn't in control of his own fate? I don't know, Carlos whispered, uncertainty lacing his voice. But I can't ignore what I've seen, what I've felt every time I face him. It's like I'm fighting something more than him. There's something else in the room with us, something invisible but powerful. Ferrero let out a sharp breath, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest. Carlos, if you're right, this changes everything. But if you're wrong, if this is just paranoia or coincidence, this could ruin your career. The stakes couldn't be higher. I know, Carlos said, his jaw clenched. But I can't live like this anymore. I need answers. No matter the cost. Ferrero nodded slowly, his expression softening. All right, he said, his voice steady. Then we start small. We gather evidence, piece by piece. No more cryptic remarks to the press, no more outbursts. You need to stay calm and focused, especially with the media watching your every move. Carlos nodded in agreement, though the tension in his chest refused to ease. He wanted to believe Ferrero was right, that a logical, methodical approach would lead to answers. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just about strategy or evidence. It was personal. Sinner wasn't just a rival, he was the key to a truth Carlos had spent years running from. The silence stretched between them as Carlos's mind drifted back, once again, to that night in Italy. He scoured the memory for details he might have overlooked. He recalled the way the man had spoken to Sinner, his tone sharp yet controlled, like a puppeteer tugging at invisible strings. And the envelope. That simple, unassuming envelope, weighed down by secrets that had haunted Carlos ever since. What do you think was in that envelope? Ferrero's voice broke through the quiet, pulling Carlos back to the present. Carlos shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. I don't know. Match data, scouting reports, maybe even something more personal. Whatever it was, it gave him an edge. But it's not just about what was inside. It's about what it meant. That night, I realized the game wasn't as pure as I thought. There's a darker side to all of this, a side no one talks about. Ferrero's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. If that's true, he said, his tone grave, then we're dealing with something far bigger than one player. But Carlos, you can't fight shadows. You need something tangible, something undeniable. I know, Carlos replied, his voice firm and resolute. And I'll find it. No matter what it takes. There was a steeliness in Carlos's words that seemed to ground Ferrero. He nodded, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They both knew the road ahead would be treacherous, that the fight they were stepping into was bigger than either of them. But for the first time, Carlos didn't feel alone. Together, they would face whatever truth lay ahead. Together, they would confront the storm. Carlos leaned back into the sofa, his body still tense but his mind clearer than it had been in years. The memories still pressed on him, vivid and unrelenting, but now they felt like pieces of a puzzle, one he was determined to solve. As the silence settled around them, Ferrero finally spoke, his voice low but steady. Tell me everything, every detail. No matter how small. Carlos took a deep breath, the weight of his memories pressing down on him. But this time, he didn't hesitate. Slowly, carefully, he began to recount everything. The tournament, the man, the envelope, the uneasy matches that followed. Ferrero listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from concern to concentration. And as Carlos spoke, he could see it, the pieces falling into place, a pattern emerging from the chaos. It wasn't just paranoia or coincidence. There was something more. For the first time in years, Carlos felt a flicker of hope. The floodgates had opened, and now there was no turning back.